It's Roe versus Wade 1 year later. Where do we go from here? Let's talk pro-life apologetics on Spirit Inspire, starting right now.
Broadcasting from the Cathedral of the Assumption in Louisville, Kentucky, this is Spirit Inspire. And now, here is your host.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Spirit Inspire. Joined with me is my co-host, Isaac Fox.
Hello, everyone.
Hey. And Eric couldn't be here with us again.
Still on vacation.
I know, still on vacation this week.
Goodness.
It's so sad, but he'll be back very shortly, so don't worry, he'll be here. But with that, today is a very, very, I think it has the makings of a powerful episode today. And I say this because we have just now passed recently the 1 year anniversary of Roe versus Wade, being overturned.
Yeah.
And that is a powerful milestone to mark, I'd say. And it's powerful because every year we'll remember, because it's always on the feast of St. John the Baptist, right? June 24th. And of course, when it was overturned, it was on the Feast of the Sacred Heart, which you can't forget those moments, right? That's just pivotal and the providence of God.
So appropriate on both of those feasts.
I know.
St. John, we have the clear understanding of his awareness of Christ in the womb. So it speaks to that there is real life in the womb.
Yes.
And he was filled with the Holy Spirit from his mother's womb. And then, of course, the Feast of the Sacred Heart. How perfect is that?
Well, think of the heart pierced by the lance, blood and water flowing out in divine mercy on the whole world, a world in so desperate need of mercy for what we've done.
Yeah.
And I think of this in terms of, to kind of set the stage, because today, I think, is important to consider both the historical implications as well as the philosophical implications of Roe versus Wade being overturned, and what we need to do to then build a culture of life and a civilization of love. Because the law may have changed, but our hearts haven't.
Right.
And how do we do that? It starts, I'd say, a little bit of history as far as salvation history goes. Think of that original prefigurement in Exodus with Moses being born during a infanticide, right? Children being thrown into the Nile River. Political move of the Pharaoh to take back possession of the land of Goshen and destroy the Hebrew people. And yet Moses was born in the midst of that, right? And in the same way, they were saved on Passover with the death of the firstborn. So it was almost like the sins of the idolatrous Egyptian culture came back to haunt them, right? God turned them over to their passions, and the angel of death came and took them, basically, based on their own choices. And it's a sad, sad reality. But that, of course, is fulfilled in the birth of Christ, in the fact that we have the death of the holy innocents, and how Christ is born in the midst of both obscurity but also horrific violence on the part of, ironically, the king of Israel, right? The very king that Samuel, the prophet, warned the people about. Hey, you're going to eventually elect this guy and the dictator and all the things.
Wish you hadn't gone down this road.
Right.
But the parallels are so striking there that the Messiah, because Moses was a Messiah. He's the prefigurement of the true Messiah, but he was a Messiah.
He was.
And when he comes, it's in the situation where you have an evil king who responds by slaughtering or is in the process of slaughtering children. And then when the true Messiah comes, it is also, again, within this context of an evil king slaughtering children.
Gosh.
And I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but I've sometimes wondered in kind of end times terms, if the return of Christ is also marked by this scourge of abortion, which has become so common in our world, the slaughter of the innocents. Again, and I don't know that, but I've wondered if that's the connection. But what is it? Why is it, John, do you think maybe that when we have these moments of the Messiah coming, why is it that innocent children suffer?
That is...
I don't know that I have an answer.
That is such a powerful question.
But it's interesting. There seems to be something about Um, I think it's kind of like a rejection of God, of his will, ends up eventually harming the most innocent, the most helpless. I don't know. It's just an interesting connection though to
And it
see
almost
that.
seems like the only way God's going to send a savior is if we go down that far and that dark. But that's not really what's happening here.
No.
It's more like through the absence of God, the rejection of God that happens gradually in the hearts of many, and they fail to or choose not to pass on the faith to their children.
Hmm.
Eventually, that raises up a generation that doesn't know God, doesn't
Right.
accept God, and that always means the creature, having rejected the Creator, becomes incoherent to itself. We don't even know
Which,
ourselves.
because the Creator is the source of our life, that then leads automatically to loss of life. You can see this in Genesis because God tells Adam and Eve, in the day you eat of it, you will die. But what's the first thing that happens after their rupture from God is their two sons, one of them kills the other.
Murder.
It's kind of like when we remove ourselves from God, we not only have destroyed the life giving relationship we have with God, we immediately then turn to destroying the living relationship we have with those around us.
Yes.
It's kind of like rejection of God always plays out in terms of murder.
Yes, and it always goes to that four-part rupture that we have with the original sin, with the rupture between our relationship with us and God, with one another, within ourselves,
Yeah.
and with all of
All of
creation.
creation.
So
Yeah.
that the abuse and the neglect and the murder is often, like, this is why they call it raping and pillaging the land,
Right.
right? And how we manipulate and distort those things. But getting back to this idea of the slaughter of the innocents, and that being the common context by which a Messiah is raised up,
Hmm.
and the mystery of that, I think of it in terms of the mercy of God, right? Like, if we didn't have a Messiah come and literally address the issues of the day and speak a language that resonates with the hearts of those who have suffered and gone through such turmoil, we wouldn't be able. There would be no hope. It would
Right.
only get worse to the point where we would literally obliterate our own
Yeah.
existence. It's tragic, but
Yeah.
yet there's something
Which
to
we're
that.
very capable of doing.
Yes.
I think one of the a thought that I have though, connecting the slaughter of the innocents with the coming of the Messiah, is this:
Hmm.
we know from Scripture that there is a connection between Jesus and the least of these, his brethren. And it's a very intimate connection, right? Christ says, "Inasmuch as you did this to the least of my brethren, you did it to me." And then we have the example of St. Paul, um, on the road to Damascus when, this tremendous experience happens. He's thrown from his horse, he's struck blind, he hears the voice of Jesus. And Jesus says to him, "Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Well, the obvious answer for Paul there would have been, "I'm not. Don't even know you."
Right.
What was Paul doing? He was persecuting the church. And so this speaks to this living reality that Christ and his church are united in such a way that what you do to one, you're doing to the other.
Yes.
So I think when we see this coming of the Messiah,
Mm.
what actually happened here? Well, why did Herod want to kill the children? He was trying to kill Jesus.
Yes.
So Herod, if you look at him as a man and try to see, okay, what's his characteristics in this story? He's a king who's afraid for his throne, right? Even though he's not really the true king, he
Never was.
should, in his context, be welcoming the coming son of David,
Right.
right? So he's trying to hold on to his own worldly position. He's clearly in some way rejected God, rejected the prophecies, rejected all of this, right? So he's not in a good relationship with God. And then there's this great sort of self-centeredness of, I want my life, my position, my money, my power, yada, 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 right? All that whole thing. And so when the Messiah comes, who is really going to change that entire world for Herod, Herod says, "No, I'm going to kill this Messiah, get him out of the way, out of the picture." But it's interesting that what happens is, rather than killing the Messiah, he ends up killing all of these children. So I think when you see that picture, it's interesting that the attempt to kill Christ plays out in real time as the killing of the least of these, my brethren,
Yes.
these little children. Because what that means to me is that Christ is somehow the image of God is there in these little children in a very special way. How we treat each other says an awful lot about our relationship with God.
Yes.
Going back to the passage in Matthew, what does Jesus say we should be doing? Giving a drink of water to the thirsty, clothing the
Right. The
naked,
corporal and spiritual works of mercy.
right. But in doing that, we are actually doing this to Jesus in some very real way. And so I think the reverse is true. It's not that Herod set out to kill little children because he just didn't like little children.
Right.
You know, he's really trying to kill Christ. And in some way, that's kind of what he's doing because the image of Christ is in these children.
Yes. And you think of Moses being born in the midst of that infanticide. Pharaoh wasn't trying to just kill children. Pharaoh, in that same vein, was really trying to reacquire the land of Goshen and prevent a military uprising, meaning he was trying to hold on to his power.
Same as Herod.
That's the
It's
exact
identical.
same process.
Yeah.
And so I think in terms of this salvific historical context, what we're facing in our culture today, I think, can be explained with, a Messiah figure, a Christ figure being raised up to address the issues and speak words that resonate on the hearts of millions, as well as I think that's John Paul II, right? Among many, but
Yeah.
he was a particular figure in that. But then there is also the reason abortion even was legalized, why it even came into being, what
Yeah.
allowed that, who was trying to hold on to power, what
Yeah.
was the dictatorial attitude that was enslaving people's hearts to convince them that this was even a good thing to do culturally,
Well,
right?
I think it's twofold.
Yeah.
I'm really struck by the fact that you honed in on that question of power, because we could say that there are many sins which could lead to harming other people. But you're right, it does seem in both these stories there's something very important about this holding on to power, right? This concern for one's position, which in turn plays out in hurting the little children.
Yes.
And the first thought that popped across my mind was just thinking of my own experience, because there are a few things that take our rights, our autonomy, our power away from us in a good way more than having little children. And I can speak to this very personally because, as you know,
You
I
can.
have a lot of them, right?
How many again?
8.
Oh my,
Right.
I love it.
So there are certain things as a father of 8 that are going to change in my life. Now, I'm very happy to have those children. I wanted to have children. I didn't think through all the consequences prior to having children.
Right.
So I was not going out asking for certain things to change in my life. But they did, whether I wanted to or not.
Yeah.
Now, I was no king on my throne, but there is, as a single person, some level of autonomy you feel.
Mm.
I can choose to do X, Y, and Z. And those don't even have to be immoral things. I'm talking about good things, the ordinary, everyday things of life, that the free choices that I feel like I can make. And then, the children come along and it's like, oh boy. I feel as if, in a sense, as parents, we think of that as a position of authority, but it's really a position of service. Much like the Pope. We call him the servant of the servants of God.
Yes.
And what does Christ say? He who would be greatest among you, let him be the least, let him be the servant of all.
Mm.
My life and that of my wife has become one of service now. But it's not like somebody came and kidnapped me and shackled me and said you have to obey me as like a slave now.
Right.
It's a service of love,
It was a
or should
free
be,
choice,
ideally.
Right.
It was a free choice. And these precious children are beings that I love, but they do absolutely have a certain rule over my life. My position on my little throne of me in charge, or thinking I'm in charge of my life, that's gone. And so I think that maybe there are two particular things in our culture that we have come to worship. They are both good things, but we've made them idols.
Yes.
Sex is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going,
There's
when
a
it
certain
becomes,
level of power that comes from that,
there is,
right?
yeah. But even besides that, there is wanting to have a certain power over sex.
Yes.
Sex
Oh,
without certain responsibilities, or sex the way
taking the
I want it.
creative powers of God into
Hmm.
our own hands, is that not the original sin,
Yeah.
right? Mm,
And then secondly, we think when Roe versus Wade actually happened initially, so much of it and all the language surrounding that in the decades since is played out within this paradigm of freedom of choice, freedom to do what I want with my body. Now, I think when we dig into the philosophical aspects of this later on, we're going to say, look, this is not your body, right? This is, I mean, we can talk to science on this. But even so, we would all agree that freedom is a good thing. I mean, that is not an evil. That is a positive good. The ability for us to have free will, the ability to have choices, the ability to not be slaves, to not be subjugated to foreign powers or whatever, right?
right.
These are good things, things that we as Christians should strive for.
Well, it makes sense that in America, having been founded on a revolution of
Right.
sorts against a
We're
dictator,
very freedom oriented people.
we are very freedom, and tragically, we're revolutionary people, right, by
Right.
nature.
And I
So
think we confuse revolution with freedom sometimes.
we can, right? Like, and I didn't really. I'm not a history buff like Eric Huff is, right?
Hmm.
But I was recently watching a video series that Roa Woods has put out on a lot of some of the current issues on gender and things like that, and they were talking about the scientific revolution, which I had never
Yeah.
cognitively heard of, and
Yeah.
I was thinking, is he confusing it with the industrial revolution? But I
No.
realized no, this is from the 1600s,
Right.
14 to 1600s,
Kind of like
that would have,
Newtonian physics
yes,
on.
that would have allowed the industrial revolution to be even be possible.
Right.
And so you start with this basically rejection of the mysterious, the immeasurable, for the measurable and the tangible
Hmm.
and the material. And
Right.
so suddenly we, instead of seeing all of creation as a window pointing us to God, we see it as God. And that has opened, sadly, God allowed this for a time, that I guess it brought advancement to society to some extent, right? Because you wouldn't have microwaves and air conditioning without
Sure.
it, right? But it gave birth to other things beyond industrialization. It brought materialism and secularism,
Hmm.
and it took men and women out of their homes and raising their children and focused them on a more mechanistic approach to
Right.
society. So machines and conveyor belts and assembly lines, right?
Well, and that's interesting you use the word mechanistic, because that's actually what the Newtonian physics is it creates a mechanistic model of the universe itself. And it's interesting that it's only been in the last 100 years with the advent of quantum mechanics that we've begun to realize that when you go, I mean, Newtonian physics hold on a surface level, but when you try to explain the entire universe in terms of this very mechanistic sort of model, it breaks down at the deepest levels.
Yes.
And so it's interesting now that science has come this far, but it's now actually beginning to sort of
Undo
undo
itself?
it, not itself in the
Or,
sense
yeah,
of science, but yeah, undo its beginnings, or undo that viewpoint.
right.
But
That's a good thing, at
but I
least.
think yeah, I think that these are two things which are good: sex and freedom.
Yes.
But I think that what's happened is we've idolized them. And isn't this really what an idol is? Taking things which in and of themselves are good, wood and stone and the things the Bible talks about, but then replacing God with them, or making too much of them.
Hmm.
And that's when they go from being a positive good to a positive and very severe evil. And I think that two things happened in the last 100 years, particularly maybe the last 60 or 70 here in the United States, but abortion didn't start in the United States. So I think maybe we'll talk about that in a moment too. But this sort of worship of sex, it gets put on a real pedestal, and also the sense of autonomy, of personal freedom. And this plays out then as I should absolutely, not just in certain cases, but I should absolutely have full control over my body and my choices. And those choices include who and how I want to have sex and what I want to happen from that sex, right? What I want to control
What
the
kind of
results.
attachments, what kind of
Right.
consequences?
I want to do this, but control the consequences. And so when this becomes an idol, when freedom of choice becomes more important than human life, then freedom of choice is like designed to bring sort of a fullness to human life, right? So that we're not slaves, we have this freedom.
Right.
But when it becomes more important than human life, it ends up becoming a master that ends up destroying our lives.
Yes.
And anytime we idolize something, it becomes a master that destroys us, whereas all of nature was meant to be subject to us, right? Have dominion over the world.
Mm,
And it's to be used for its proper uses.
yes.
It's to be treated in a certain way with respect, but also as, in some way, under the dignity of the human person. And when anything in nature gets elevated above that, we become the slave and it destroys us.
It's a tragedy when that happens. And that's, I think, why we are facing such turmoil today. I mean, because you get from the scientific revolution to the industrial revolution, it gives birth to the sexual revolution.
Of course.
And then, of course, we have the technological revolution. And when you combine those two, now we have what is called the gender revolution or the
And you
transhumanism revolution.
and even
It's
before that, when you have the technological combined with the sexual, because the sexual revolution is this attempt to allow for maybe too much freedom in
right.
sexual matters,
Well, freedom more
but
license than
right,
freedom, right?
exactly, not a true freedom, but a license.
Hmm.
But when you attempt to go down that road, there's still going to be consequences and results until you can bring technology in and say, okay, now I got the license and I've got the technology to fix the problem. So, I mean, we can look even back to contraception.
Yep.
We can talk about abortion. We can talk about a lot of things even before getting to the transgender movement, where technology kind of combined with the sexual revolution to enable people to feel they could do those things without apparent
Yes,
consequences.
and it goes back to that mechanistic mentality
Yeah.
that people have kind of absorbed through all the changes in society over the last 400 or 500 years. And you think back to Israel and Egypt, they were in slavery for about
100
400
years.
years,
Yeah.
right? And so I look at the anniversary of Roe versus Wade being overturned as like this cosmic midpoint from the you know slavery to the moment of deliverance.
Yeah.
Now we're going to be in a wilderness for a while,
Yeah, because
but
the story's not over.
right,
As you said at the beginning, it's one thing about a law changing. And in one sense, it's not even a full change of the law, right? This simply sort of allows state freedom.
right.
So it doesn't mean an end to abortion,
No, it doesn't.
but it's a lot more to change hearts at that point. And then also, look, it's great if we have abortion not legalized. But what's causing abortion?
Correct.
And so this is another issue,
What's
and
the
it's a
root?
big one. Why are people looking for abortions? If we want to go deeper, we need to look at healing that aspect of the culture
Hmm.
to where it becomes something that isn't wanted.
Yes, it's something where, and this is honestly, this is why I fell in love with theology of the body. This
Hmm.
is actually what my good friends, Donna and Gary Burry, who helped found FRP, this is part of why they founded it. They realized that men and women going into abortion clinics are there because we have failed them as a society
Exactly.
at helping them understand the dignity of the human person. So the root cause happens long before they're walking down that sidewalk toward that place.
Yeah.
It is something that requires decades of formation and absorbing a different language, a different worldview, a different ideology. And this is where words have power, ideas have consequences. And so abortion is simply the fruit of centuries of ideological tumult,
Yeah.
total confusion and change to overthrow the God who made us, to replace him with the image of ourselves in a position of power to then control and manipulate the forces of life, the creative powers of being itself, right?
And I think It's not just ideological, it's also very practical because people find themselves in situations where
Right.
they feel like, okay, the only way out is to have an abortion. How can we be used by God in our culture to make those situations less rare or more rare? Sorry. Um,
Right.
and I was actually thinking of something because you were talking about how these failings. Well, as Christians, we are called upon to speak the truth and love,
Mhm.
and we are also called upon to be very life focused. But that doesn't mean that we haven't failed badly in many cases throughout history.
Correct.
And I was thinking of the series Downton Abbey. Have you seen it?
I've seen a few episodes,
Yeah,
maybe. Yep.
my wife and I got hooked on it when it came out. So,
That's cool.
but I don't remember which season it was. But there's one in which one of the daughters has an affair, gets pregnant. Now, this is in a very upper class British family, somewhere World War I, World War II. I don't remember which season this was, and she has, oh golly, somebody will probably correct me on YouTube. Maybe it's her grandmother, some relative, right, older relative, who is obviously not somebody you would expect would, you know, promote abortion. And she's probably horrified to go into this at time very illegal clinic. But she is also more horrified by the impropriety of somebody in their fine state of life having this affair.
Mm.
So she actually brings the girl, gets an appointment at this like secret top floor clinic in London, right? And thankfully, the daughter at the last moment opts to have the baby and they leave the clinic. Then, of course, the baby is raised, it's given to a couple who's farming their property, tenant farmers, to raise as if it's theirs. And nobody, friends, family, nobody else is supposed to know that that was her baby, right? She just leaves town for a while
Yeah.
because this would bring so much humiliation on this family. And then this plays out over the next season or two with a lot of really painful tragedy because the farmer's wife has some mental issues and I think they couldn't have children and she becomes obsessively attached to the child.
Oh
And
my.
then the daughter in the family is trying to, sneak these visits to see her daughter, and there's a lot of drama around it. But you think back about all of this, what induced them to consider this option of abortion? Well, nobody on the show seems to be overtly Christian, but they're in a very Christian milieu. Okay, this is kind of still the height of Anglicanism. England's still considered a Christian country.
Hmm.
Morals and values and all of this are super important still. But it's also in this very cold way.
Oh yeah.
You don't run to your dad and say, Dad, I'm, a teenage girl, I'm early 20s, whatever. I made a mistake and I'm pregnant, and expect your dad to be like, or your mom to be like, oh, honey, it's going to be okay. We're going to be with you and help support you.
Right.
These very, I don't want to call them morals because they're not actually morals, but it's this sense of propriety, which is probably rooted in a moral understanding,
That's
but
a
has
better
become
word.
very cold and distant from that,
Yes.
becomes then very harsh. It's like you're taking this Christian morality of you should wait until marriage to have sex, and then removing all charity from it to where it's become, you horrible person, you had sex before marriage. I don't want to see you. I want nothing to do with you. I want you to get rid of your baby and any hint or sign you ever made this mistake. Well, that's exactly the kind of behavior that will push somebody towards an abortion.
Yes. Yes.
And I know it's a long-winded way to say what I was trying to say, but I think that we have often, as Christians, been, I know I'm not saying like individually, but as a culture, been responsible for lack of charity that helps to drive people into situations where they then feel the need to go down these roads that in the end only make their lives worse.
Yes. It's
It's very
funny.
tragic.
It's funny you said that because when I was in high school, I was in a play with my church
Hmm.
theater troupe, and we did a play called Kiss and Tell, which was set in the 1940s. And in fact, they made a movie about it probably 10 years later, starring Shirley Temple when she was a young
Okay.
adult.
I've never seen it,
And
but the name sounds
yeah,
familiar.
and I starred as one of the main characters, and my future wife was also in this play, which is great, as
Nice.
was my mom and dad, and now father-in-law.
Did you all kiss and
Um,
tell?
we were not in a position where we could kiss. And
Okay.
this is actually when I started developing a crush on her,
Okay, so
which
you're fairly young
was
at the
kind of
time.
secret. Yeah, well, I was like 18, I'd
Okay,
say.
okay, so not super young.
But I was playing like part of 15-year-old,
Gotcha.
and he was kind of a klutz and a goofball, and he kind of was all over the place. And the whole premise of this play was that the girl he has a crush on, uh, uh, her best friend is secretly marrying her brother because he's in the war and they want to do elope without the parents knowing. But at the same time, her best friend and her families are at major odds with one another because there's feelings of one being a bad influence, and the whole point of the play is that one person is thought to be pregnant that is not,
Gotcha.
and so they elope, they get pregnant, but nobody knows they're married.
Mm-hmm.
And so somebody sees this girl accompanying her best friend to the obstetrics office,
Mm-hmm.
and they think that, oh, well, that means that she's pregnant because they didn't see her. They
Right.
only saw the younger girl.
Right, right.
And so everybody's wondering who could possibly be responsible for getting her pregnant. And of course, it's the bumbling guy that I'm playing the part of, right? But so it's a situational comedy just
Sure.
to kind of emphasize people's reaction to an unexpected pregnancy and holding to this propriety that you're talking about. I mean, they were literally considering marrying them off up in Vermont, 1,000 miles away, and then coming home with a baby sister or something, grounding them for their lives, whatever. I mean, it was just hilarious how they did it. The dad's calling the obstetrics office and trying to talk to the guy and say, I'm going to kill the guy. Like, it's funny how they portray it, but how often is that people's actual lived experience that
It's
isn't
like that or
funny?
worse. Yeah.
It's what pushes people to actually consider, well, I don't want to deal with that kind of pain or judgment or shame, and I'd rather abort the child.
Yeah. Because I think it's not always, especially in cases like teen pregnancies and stuff, it's not always a matter of, I don't want to go through this, I don't want to deal with the child. But I think often it is a matter of, I want to hide this from my family.
Yes.
And I think that's the point I'm trying to get at here a little bit too, is it's not just about a law having been overturned. And as you said, it's also about changing hearts. But part of that is when we ask, why do abortions happen? We realize that there is a lot that needs to be done in our society, in our culture.
Massively,
a tremendous amount that is also very incumbent upon us as Christians. We preach charity. Well, we better show it. Not just say, thou shalt not, but also say, let me put myself out there in such a way that changes can happen to where you won't be in that position.
yes.
Or if you are in that position, you're not treated as some societal reject and marginalized, but you're shown love, help, compassion, all the rest of it. There's many reasons for abortion.
It's interesting, though, to me to think that, because yes, we have a long way to go, but how did we even get to a point where Roe versus Wade could even be overturned?
Let's talk about that.
How many of us felt that, yes, I want to believe that I'll be the pro-life generation. I'll see Roe versus Wade overturned one day. I will.
I didn't think it was going to happen.
But how many actually really knew that or believed that? Right, exactly. And it's so easy to feel that before, right? On this side, it's like, what?
Right.
What? But I look at it as evidence of obviously political timing and, the right person was in place to appoint the right Supreme Court justices.
But all of
blah,
that
blah,
was
blah,
weird
blah, blah.
and crazy. All of that felt like it shouldn't have happened.
Exactly. It was
So
it was
gotta be
cosmic.
providence.
It was
Yeah.
providential. And I heard a priest once say that, as the amount of perpetual adoration chapels
Mhm.
rose and surpassed the amount of abortion clinics, so too did the abortions start to decrease. And even the pregnancy centers started to increase to the point where they also one day surpassed the amount of abortion clinics open in this country. So what we're realizing is that when Roe versus Wade was implemented in 1973, that was the height of the sexual revolution and the cultural upheaval and the ultimate fruit, perhaps, of the Cartesian worldview, and some of the scientific and industrialized attitudes that had pervaded people. But and obviously there are massive repercussions that have flowed from that since then, right?
Hmm.
All the way to the old Bergeveld versus Hodges case in 2015, the legalized gay marriage, right?
Hmm.
I understand all of those connections, but we have to also recognize that abortion kept increasing after Roe versus Wade legalized it in all 50 American states until about the year 1990.
Hmm.
And this was right around the time that, the 1980s and 90s was when our generation was being born, right? So, in some terrifying way, to think of, John Paul II may have been the man who rose up from the Nazi Holocaust and the communist,
Yeah.
ideologies. But who is being raised up today that survived the abortion Holocaust to then address these issues and actually communicate with people in a way that resonates on their hearts and helps them address this? Not just to overturn a law or a court case, but to transform hearts and change whole lifestyles so that abortion's unthinkable, undesirable. There would never be a situation that could possibly happen, even the most horrific cases,
Hmm.
that we would even consider abortion.
Right.
Right. And that's what we have to do. And to do that, I think it would be valuable, could be helpful if we looked at maybe some, not arguments for argument's sake, but more ideas,
Yeah.
concepts of what is the human person? What
Right.
is, I mean, I know we did an entire 2 episodes on what is man, right?
Right.
And so those are valuable
Well, I
things
guess
that kind of
we could
contribute
say
to this. But
what is a fetus?
what
Maybe.
is a fetus?
Yeah.
What is the unborn? Or what, a new term that's come about in the last
Preborn.
10 years? What is the preborn?
Right.
Right? So that we don't just get this idea that, oh, this is unborn. You'll
Right.
never be born.
Right.
But rather, you're going to be born.
Right.
That's
This is
just
like
the obvious
the
thing.
automatic result that's going to
Right.
happen.
If you didn't do anything and nature took its course, odds are the child's going to continue developing naturally
Yeah.
and in a healthy way in the womb and then be born into the world. Right.
You know, I think this is really important. I did want to just real quickly
Yeah, sure.
jump back to something because you were talking about history a moment ago. And of course, abortion didn't start in the United States. And of course, abortion has been around for centuries. It's not a new idea,
Right.
but on a limited, smaller scale, right? Um,
Oh yes, that's also important. It's not just an American problem.
no. And so we look at some of the things that seemed to bring us there in the US, but we also need to look back a little bit further. And it's interesting because in modern times, so again, abortion, people have attempted to have abortion for a long time. But again, it's been small scale, little clinics, certain doctors. And this goes back way in history. The idea of sort of abortion as a choice across the board and being super common, that is very modern. That is very recent. And so before Roe versus Wade, within this modern setting, it first appears on this sort of scale in communist Russia. And this is very interesting because you also spoke
Mm.
of some of the other ideological mistakes that we've made in modern times and the rupture of the family. So you go back to the Bolshevist Revolution in 1917, and then you go a little bit past that. Um, well, this is when things start actually happening, but I should actually go earlier. Look at the Communist Manifesto and some of the ideas that were laid out in that. Well, one of the big principles was the destruction of the family.
Yes.
This was considered a bourgeois construct, right? It was designed, had nothing to do with a moral or a natural or a divinely mandated arrangement, none of that. Marriage was seen to be purely an economic factor that had been imposed by the wealthy to control society, right?
Mhm.
And so it was explicitly stated in the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels that they, in fact, wanted to destroy this notion of the family. And in fact, in a bit of rhetoric, they say something to the effect of So we as communists are being accused of wanting to, abolish the family. To this charge, we plead guilty, and they go on to say this is because we think family is bad, and it's a part of this
My
sort of
gosh.
bourgeois thing, and they point out justifiably the hypocrisy of many people at the time who,
And that's a legitimate criticism
sure,
of hypocrisy. With, I mean, think of the play I referenced,
hmm,
or Downton Abbey. There
sure.
is hypocrisy of how people treat
Oh
others.
yeah, or people talking about family, and I think about this now. You mentioned gay marriage a moment ago. Um, People that may be on supposedly religious grounds opposing that, but then are okay with their fifth divorce. It's like, well, okay, maybe this means neither side
And
has
this is where
understood.
we need a holistic Christian
Right, because
anthropology.
it's like if you're okay with that, then that side hasn't understood marriage either, right?
Right.
But anyway, how does this play out historically? Well, there was an actual attempt after the revolution to split the family. It was very intentional. And it was to really do away with this traditional bourgeois notion of family, supposedly capitalist notion of family. And so, um, couched under things that looked good, like more freedom for women, for example, options were then forced. So women could not only go out and work and get jobs, they were forced to. And in the early days after the revolution, men and women who were married were intentionally sent to work in places separate from each other, often to where you had to travel by train. The idea was to get rid of those familial ties.
My
So it
gosh.
wasn't just a matter of saying, okay, women, you're emancipated now, you can go out and get a job and yada, yada. You don't have to stay at home and raise the kids and cook, right? So that could sound really good. But instead it was, the communist superiors were saying, all right, you're going to go work in Minsk, and you're going to go work in
Separate them,
wherever,
get them out of the mentality of being together on a
right?
regular basis.
And so divorce became actually encouraged.
Right.
And the next thing that was also became acceptable was abortion. So you begin with this destruction of the family, particularly the initial unit, the husband and wife, which then leads to great promiscuity. And that's okay in this
In this
worldview,
worldview, right.
because if you're doing that, you're not overly attached to your spouse,
Correct.
because you're supposed to be attached to the state,
Right.
right?
Right.
Not to the spouse. And so this, of course, leads to several things: the promiscuity, and then multiple cases of divorce and remarriage. Many times, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. And then, of course, you also have these situations where there's an unintended pregnancy in the situation. And so throughout Russia, they began setting up abortion clinics throughout Russia. So this predates Roe versus Wade by 60 plus years, right? Well, what's interesting is this situation was so forced on the people that it became widespread almost overnight. Divorce, abortion, all of this. And it therefore happened so quickly, more quickly than it did here in the United States, that the Russians woke up to it more quickly than we have, because the consequences were catastrophic.
Yes.
And in a matter of not more than a few years in communist Russia, they began fining people for having too many remarriages and trying to make abortion more costly. I think there was fines applied to that as well. They began to try to clamp down on the very thing that had been promoted
Even
5, 10 years
giving
earlier.
incentives, financial incentives to couples
Yeah.
for having children.
Yeah.
Right. Like, wow.
So it's like it became so bad so quickly because it was being forced on people that they sort of reaped the fruits more quickly than we apparently did here in the United States,
Yeah.
and immediately said, whoa, this is not working out. We need to put the brakes on. Whereas in the United States, it took us or is still taking us a lot longer to figure that out. But one little last side note on this, and I want to get into what you were going to talk about, and maybe we could take a break, get some more water here
Yeah.
in a
Let's
moment.
take a break before we do that.
But just one little interesting historical tidbit is around 1969, 1970, here in the United States, and this is the height of the sexual revolution, there was a group called the Weather Underground. I don't know if have you ever heard of them?
Mm-mm.
Okay. They were sort of an offshoot of a number of a sort of larger umbrella group that had started in universities. I want to say it was called like the SDS, Students for Democratic Society, or something like that. In spite of the word democratic, it was more of a sort of a socialist backdrop in ideology behind these groups.
Sure.
And they were involved in trying to change things in universities. They were involved in the civil rights movements and protests and so forth. But the Weather Underground was an offshoot, and they were very radical, much more so than the SDS or whatever the acronym was there. And the Weather Underground was explicitly neo-Marxist, right? So they were definitely pushing a sort of communist agenda. And they were a lot more radical in their activity and in their beliefs. But around they only lasted for a few years. They ended up being declared as a domestic terrorist group and were shut down, right?
Okay.
Though certain members still exist today and have some influence that's quite interesting in our country currently, but that's a whole another
Sure.
show. But around 1970 to 71, I believe it was either 71 to 72 or 70 to 71, they began what they called a program that was entitled Smash Monogamy. Okay, so this is rather interesting because this ties in with what I was just saying about Russia. They began hosting orgies amongst their groups. Now, you might think, okay, this is like sexual revolution days,
Right.
69, 70, 71. This is Woodstock. This is free love. So maybe they were doing it just because they wanted to,
Right.
right? Maybe they were doing it just out of passion. No. This was intentional on the part of the leaders because they were Marxists in their thinking. They did not want the members of their group to have not only spouses, but boyfriend and girlfriend, because this led to an emotional attachment that was greater than the state. But in Marxism, nothing is greater than the state,
Right.
right? Or the collective. This was a case of a collective that was not the state, it was a society. So by forcing people, you were actually forced to attend these orgies, right? This was like a rule in
That's
the group.
horrifying.
It is horrifying, but the idea was rather devilishly understandable. The idea was break all personal ties.
Right.
So you're going to have to cheat on your boyfriend or girlfriend, right? And therefore, you all will not develop these deeper attachments. But again, you reap what you sow. And so this, again, is in this sort of Marxist setting. It is intentionally trying to break down family, personal ties, and so forth. So they have these series of orgies for a year, and they cut them because everybody had gotten diseases, and they had to stop doing it.
That is amazing.
Yeah, true story.
Talk about a healthy fear of the Lord, or rather, let's say
just the way nature works.
The way nature works,
which God designed, but
that God designed. So it demonstrates God's power, God's ultimate design, regardless of human opinion and all of this this relativistic worldview that is really fueling all of this. Right? You can cheat because you're not actually cheating. You're doing whatever you want.
Yeah.
That's freedom, right? That's love. Because we've redefined freedom. We've redefined love to suit our base instinctual desires that aren't even based on our actual instincts at all. And it kind of robs us of our humanity, emasculates us or defeminizes women, right? Objectifies everyone and turns us into a collection of body parts.
Yeah.
And that's obviously where things like abortion become necessary.
Yeah.
Because that's the only way to maintain the quote status quo.
Necessary in air quotes.
Yes, air quotes, right?
Yeah.
Not really necessary. It's
no,
always
but within that worldview, it then it seems necessary.
Yes,
that you have to
it's
have
basic
that option.
supply and demand. I did a paper in college on the culture of death. I took a class called Understanding Human Rights. It probably should have been called Understanding the United Nations Agenda,
right?
Which was really intense, because they had talked all about by 2020 we want to eliminate poverty, and I'm thinking, well, how do you eliminate poverty? You don't love the poor. You eliminate poverty by killing, abortion, euthanasia, contraception. And so I wrote a paper called Understanding the Culture of Death, a Human Rights Tragedy, right? And I broke down all of the different critically important moral issues the church is facing in the world. And I looked at the connection between contraception and abortion, and
it's a big one.
When contraception was legalized in 1965 compared to when Roe versus Wade was legalized in 1973, Did you know that before 1965, and again, I don't know the reference or the data, so you'd have to do some research. You're probably not going to find a lot of this kind of stuff on the CDC,
Yeah.
but to recognize that the CDC is not God, I found lots of contradictory information on
Oh,
that same
sure.
website. So,
But there are
um,
very good, very solid statistics one can find on this. And I know
exactly.
where you're going with this,
Yes.
so go ahead.
And so in 1965 and before, for every 1,000 births, about one child was aborted illegally
Hmm.
because it was against the law in America, right? And in 1966, 1 year after contraception was legalized, that number jumped from 1 to 2 out of every 1,000.
And it's
In
key that this is before the legalization.
Before it was legalized, and
So
then
it's still within the same legal context that
yes,
the number doubles.
and then in 1967, it was 4.
Yeah.
8, 16, it would basically exponentially increase almost to the point where by 1973, it was over 200 children were being aborted per 1,000. And it continued to increase by the mid 1980s, it was just over 300, which means this is what it means when people say 1/3 of my generation has been lost to abortion. 1/3.
It's heavy.
And yet, to think of since those days, we have found a new generation of Catholics, of Christians, of human beings recognizing the horrors and the tragedies of this bombarding culture of rebellion, and they're addressing it.
Yeah.
They're actually talking about issues that face marriage, family, sexuality in healthy ways. Now, we still have a long way to go, obviously, because there's a whole subsection of culture that is growing in popularity and acceptance that has a totally different worldview, right? And that kind of leads us to kind of a clash of ideas and concepts, not in ways that we can just let's get into debates and arguments, but rather let's get into healthy discussion and learn how to respect one another so that we can actually arrive at the truth of things. That's the point.
But that's, you said, 1/3 of our generation. That's huge. And again,
It's mind-numbing.
That takes us right back where we started with the slaughter of the holy innocents at the birth of Christ, or 2
Yes.
years after the birth of Christ.
So there's this powerful
And-
video I saw on YouTube called The Sound of Abortion, and it was made 10 years ago by, I think, a guy named Peter Heck. And he said, I just want you to shut your eyes, and for the next minute, we're going to just drop metal BBs in a tin can. And each BB represents 10,000 lives who have been lost in America's wars. And it went through the Revolutionary War, Civil War, all the different wars, right? Even the War of 1812, like all up to the war in Iraq. And then after all of these BBs were dropped, which was a lot to represent, they said since 1973, the war on the unborn child. And it started with a trickle, and then it just exploded. Yeah. And it lasted for probably 30 seconds of this minute and a half video. It's just chilling. It's just audible, but to hear the weight that each BB represents 10,000. And that was made 10 years ago.
Not just one, but 10,000.
That's unfathomable. And we have a long way to go.
The sound was heard in Ramah, weeping in loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children, and she could not be comforted because they were not. Lord have mercy.
Lord have mercy.
Yeah.
So with that, everyone, we're going to take a break. We'll be back shortly to get into some of the arguments and the ideas, the philosophy, and some of the practical things that we can do to help instill within people the culture of life that John Paul II called us to, the civilization of love that Jesus Christ established with his death and resurrection. We'll see you in a second. Hey everyone, this week's episode is sponsored by Family Renewal Project. FRP is a local theology of the body apostolate in service to the Archdiocese of Louisville. They're dedicated to renewing the culture through the renewal of the family. They have so many amazing things going on, so check them out at familyrenewalproject.com. Welcome back, everyone, to Spirit Inspire. We've been talking about the 1 year anniversary of the overturning of Roe versus Wade and the implications of that, both historically as well as philosophically, and what we have been charged by God to do and to be for others who may not understand why this happened, where the law has changed but our hearts have not. The regulations have maybe gone back to the states where it's no longer federally or nationally recognized, but yet it's still something that people want. There's still a demand for. There's still an unhealthy attitude or a misunderstanding of why this is been changed, right? And so this is a moment where, we talked about the darkness, we've talked about all the different things that have led to these difficult days, but yet now I think it's important to see, all right, what do we do from here?
Yeah.
Where do we go and how do we address this? And I have some different ideas and experience from my time in college working in the pro-life movement with our College Students for Life
Hmm.
group. But I didn't know if you had any particular thoughts or things that you wanted to start with before I launch into some of my background with this.
Yeah, not a lot. Um, I think moving forward is a big question, and I think prayer and charity are going to have to be at the forefront of that because again, the pro-life person is not doing their pro-life thing in order to impose laws on people,
Correct. Right.
right? Or excuse me. We do what we do for one reason and one reason only. And that is a very positive reason. That is because we believe that what is in the womb is a child, is a human person. And I have lots of thoughts about that.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sure we both do.
Yes.
Because that is the key to this now decades old discussion. And there are many genuine folks on both sides. I suspect that there have to be a lot of people on the pro-choice side who are going to say that that's not really a child because if you knew it was, how many people would actually have an abortion?
Mhm.
Hopefully that number would be tiny then at that point. So there's this real belief that that's not a child. But at the same time, we have sort of a smoke screen of language that has grown up around this, of rhetoric. So the pro-choice side is often presented with a lot of slogans that miss the point.
Yes.
We hear about pro-choice. We hear about sexual and reproductive health. We hear about
My
women's
body,
rights.
my choice.
My body, my choice. We hear about poverty. We hear a lot about the hard cases like rape and incest. Okay?
Yes.
And by the way, when we deal with ethics, we should not expect that just because there's a hard case, that means the ethical position is wrong. We wouldn't need ethical philosophers if everything was blatantly obvious.
Right.
In every case, there are going to be, you take some kind of like basic moral principle, like thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not steal. We're always going to come across somebody who can pose a problem. Well, what about in this really weird case? And you're like, ooh, that's a bit of a head scratcher. That doesn't mean the basic principle is wrong, right?
Right. The abnormal doesn't dictate the norm.
Right, and that I think is where we've gotten this really backwards, is because there's this tendency in our culture to focus in on the hard cases, which some of them are very hard cases and require really nuanced ethical thought to understand them.
And sensitivity and compassion. Like you
course.
have to recognize, like if someone were to say, I was raped, why can't
Especially
I
at a
get
young
an abortion?
age. Yeah.
You don't start with, well, because of this, and that. You say, I'm so sorry
Yeah.
that this happened to you. Or I'm so sorry that this happened to someone you know, right? Or if I'm so sorry that this happens. This is such a
And it's not
terrible,
just a
terrible
line.
thing.
It's comes from the heart because
It means,
this
right.
is an absolute tragedy. If we begin to recognize the devastating horror of such an action that is actually very closely related to abortion, because it is a complete dehumanization and
Violation.
violation. I guess
No.
that's that just sounded funny when I started violating, but I guess violation.
A deep and violating thing.
Yeah, we'll change the grammatical
right.
structure to make that sound
Right,
better.
right.
That in a way, to me, rape is murder.
Yes.
Because it is a complete denial of what makes a person, right? It is where a person has said, you are only a body. You have no rights, no freedom, no personality. You are just there and there for my particular use. That is spiritual murder, right? So they're very connected.
Yes, and we have to help people see patiently, lovingly, that it, as terrible and horrifically violating and evil as rape might be, to then choose to, as a solution to that horrific experience, to then enact another horrific
Yeah.
experience upon your body and upon the body of another human being, does not take away or bring healing in any way. If anything, it only multiplies and adds to the stress. There might be some temporal and temporary uh, feeling of relief because of the lack of conflict or pressure from certain family members or friends from that point forward for a period of time. But the years and the weight of that pain are beyond comprehension
Oh
for
yeah,
many.
and this is something which is obviously there's basically silence on in the pro-choice movement. Is we have again real statistics on the psychological impact that abortion has on people, even ones who went in fully convinced that it was the best in their situation, that this is not really a child. Those are dealt with in the majority of cases. There are massive psychological traumas that take a lifetime to heal. But again, I think this smoke screen of language, of slogans, of hard cases, all of this obscures the fundamental question, and it is the only question that needs to be asked.
Correct.
Is this a human life? Because if it is, everything changes. If it's not, well, even if it's not, I wouldn't still say that anything goes. And that's kind of interesting because when you think about surgeries, but let's say it's just a surgery,
Mm-hmm.
just a surgery on the mother's body.
Right?
We have more rules and laws and regulations regarding what you actually can do with your body in any other medical case than we have with abortion, which is
Yes.
very ironic
It
to
is
me.
ironic.
You do not get, like, look, John, if I walked up to you and you're in some sort of like really weird sadistic mood, or not sadistic, masochistic, sorry,
Yeah.
wrong one there, and I saw you like sawing off your arm, I'm like kind of morally obligated to stop you.
Yes.
If a police officer walked by, they'd be like, dude, what are you doing? You can't do that to yourself. Right. So we don't allow people to have a complete freedom over their bodies. And yet in this case, it's like children haven't needed parental consent like you would need with other surgeries. All this stuff goes out the window. So yeah, even if it's not a child, I would still say that it is it's something that, even if it was not a child, if it was morally acceptable, still should require more safeguards. It can't just be a free-for-all even then. But nonetheless, bottom line is it a child or not? That's really the only question worth asking. And last thing, I'll shut up for a moment because I want to hear your thoughts. But I was thinking earlier of Dr. Bernard Nathanson. He was an activist for abortion back in the days leading up to Roe versus Wade, and remained so for some time. And I think he was actually kind of influential in a lot of the public push that sort of ended up becoming leading to Roe versus Wade. He was a very brilliant Jewish doctor, and he performed many abortions himself. And then about a decade of this, and his entire perspective went and changed up completely upside down. And for him, it was not a religious thing. He actually eventually became a religious person, but it was after his conversion to being pro-life, not the other way around.
Cool.
Yeah,
That's
it's very
good.
cool. And it's very important, actually, because his conversion was purely scientific. This was in the very early days when he believed very firmly this was purely a part of the mother's body. This was not a child. It was complete conviction on his part. And this was in the days before ultrasounds became common. And it was ultrasounds that changed his mind.
Ultrasounds weren't even invented until like the 1980s.
Yeah, it was it would have been around early 1980s this happened. And so he produced a documentary in 1984 called The Silent Scream, which you may have heard of. It's one of the most important early pro-life documentaries.
Wow.
And it was based around where he had come to from understanding ultrasounds, right?
Yeah.
What is interesting is in 1996, he did, in fact, enter the Catholic Church. He was um, given the sacraments of initiation by Cardinal John O'Connor,
Oh, wow.
actually. Yeah. Um, but then, of course, he was also reckoning not only would he become a major pro-life force, huge one, for many years. I think he died in the 2000s.
Mm.
But then he also had to reckon with what he had done in the
Yeah, I
past.
couldn't imagine.
Because if memory serves me correctly, I've read his autobiography, and it's powerful. If memory serves me correctly, I'm pretty much 100% positive he had aborted more than one of his own children. And when he was asked, because he was
Wow.
Jewish, but during his time as an abortionist, he was an atheist. It was kind of like culturally Jewish, and he became an atheist.
Sure.
So moving from that, why didn't he go back to Judaism? And he was asked, why did you become Catholic? And his answer was, there is no, and I can't quote this exactly, but it was something to the effect of, there is no religion which understands forgiveness the way the Catholic Church does.
Mm.
And
Mm.
you can certainly understand why he was into
Yes.
that.
And this is why divine mercy is so important.
But this was a case, though, it's a very compelling example of a very brilliant doctor who was an abortionist, whose mind was changed on this, who came from a very honest perspective of, I don't believe this is a human life, and then changed to, I have evidence that convinces me this is a human life.
Yeah.
And that I think is, bottom line, that is the sort of philosophical position we need to discuss moving forward. But again, arguments are not everything, because you can attempt to convince everybody of certain facts. Doesn't matter how clear you make those facts or how true they really are, you still have the hard question, and then you have the cultural and societal questions. So to me, we really need to not be distracted by the smokescreens. We need to hone in, as far as arguments go, on this is a human life. But then at the same time, we don't just say, look, we've got arguments and a law maybe got passed or changed last year, and so cool, that's it. That still has not addressed the underlying tragedies, hurts, problems, why we are even here in our culture.
Yes.
And this is nothing less that is called for but Christian mission, to bring the love and mercy of God to all the world. That's what we're called to from the very beginning, and that's never changed.
This is the Great Commission, you
Yeah.
know. And that was something actually I experienced personally in college, even when I was going to World Youth Day and all those pilgrimages. I remember the theme for Madrid was rooted firm in the faith. We talked about this last week with Father John Paul Kern a
Yeah.
little bit. And the one in Rio was go and make disciples of all nations.
Mhm.
And so it was the Great Commission, this sense of really reaching people. And between Madrid and Rio, I was getting heavily involved in our pro-life group on our college campus.
Yeah.
And we actually made national headlines right before I entered my senior year. So we were doing the basics of what most Students for Life groups do on college campuses, where you have sidewalk chalk messages with, scientific facts as well as pro-life quotes.
Right.
And of course, people scratch them out or write all kinds of terrible things
Sure.
in response. You also do tabling, where you set up a table and you have your literature and different resources, and you try to strike up conversation with people. There was clipboarding, where our campus minister, who helped us found our group, taught us to literally just walk up to people who are going to class and say, hey, can I chat with you, and walk
Mhm.
with you to class? And you just ask them questions that we've predetermined about, just to gauge the college campus, right?
Right.
And these were all really, really kind of nerve-wracking things to even consider doing. Like, first off, you think, oh, am I breaking a school rule by writing in the middle of the night? Because you feel like you're like defacing the sidewalk, and you make all these excuses. I don't want to talk to somebody about this, because what if they bite my head off, or if they've done something?
She probably will bite your head off. Some of them will,
Right,
yeah.
exactly. And you might face that, right? So it really forced us to say, do we actually want to take a stand on this or not?
Mhm.
And I remember we decided, well, we wanted to do a display, and it was a display to get people's attention. And we called it Life Week. And we did this during April. It was actually, we started putting these up on Sunday, Divine Mercy Sunday, which was a powerful day to begin this project. But it was on the old football stadium, and we used red and white. A red and black tablecloth. And one of the big things that we did months before was this thing called the Pro-Life Day of Silent Solidarity, where people, college students, would wear duct tape over their mouth, red duct tape,
Mm.
with in black Sharpie the word life. And so using the tablecloth, we then constructed a massive display of the word life as if it was this, red and white, red and black duct tape, but it was on a football stadium covering all the bleachers. And we put popsicle stick crosses glued together, and we would tape them to a spot that someone could have been sitting at.
Hmm.
And we filled that stadium. And sure enough, we estimated that about 4,000 people could fit in that section of the stadium that we
Right.
filled. And that is the high number of how many children were being aborted in the United States every single day.
Jeez.
Between 3,300 and 4,000 every day. And so we put signs up, and we left it up for an entire week, had tabling, and we actually did 24-hour surveillance. And on the last night of the display, because we didn't want it to get vandalized, because we had heard of other student groups having this
Sure.
happen, a student came with her boyfriend, and apparently she claimed she had permission from her art teacher to do this as her art project, because this was also an art project of one of our
Right.
students. And she and her boyfriend put condoms on all the crosses
Jeez.
to say that, no, if you increase contraception, you'll decrease abortion. That's the real issue. And it's like, no, you're missing the point. And it goes back to what we talked about in the last
Right.
segment. And we got the police involved, and she had to take him down before daylight came so that nobody else would see it, but she still got to take pictures. She still got credit. And then they put posters up all over campus with a picture of a condom that said in the middle, "Never apologize for your art." So we were all of a sudden criminalized and demonized. And it ended up in the Bowling Green News, as well as Students for Life of America picked it up and made it national, where the president of Students for Life was interviewed on like Fox News or other places about this. And we got a lawyer involved from the Alliance Defending Freedom who helped us. But that single moment, that single few days of intensity, forced us to see that this isn't about making some big statement.
Right.
There's your 15 seconds of fame.
Right.
We won runner-up for Students for Life of the Year. It was a great experience, but all we learned was it's not about being some big pro-life rock star or winning an argument. It's about learning how to win hearts. And so, as cool and intense and terrifying as that, the results of her actions and the repercussions on the campus were toward our group, I look at that as not the most powerful or important things that happened during that.
Right.
I look at it as a friend of mine in my theater class came up to me having seen the display, and he said to me in tears, "John, thank you for doing this. I just have to say that my girlfriend just got an abortion, and I didn't want her to do it, and I tried to convince her to not to do it, but she did it anyway. And I feel like I just lost my chance of being a dad. So thank you." And that's the kind of stuff that matters. That's what actually changes hearts, and not just changes them, but softens hearts. Because sometimes the only way the heart changes is through the patient, tender love that others show toward them to help them put down their defenses and be vulnerable and recognize that I'm not out to get you or prove a point or shove a law down your throat and make you live a certain way. I'm here to love you.
Right.
To love you so profoundly, so gratuitously, that you recognize your own dignity, that you see your own humanity. You see the humanity and dignity of other people so that you would do nothing less than uphold and respect another.
Yeah, that's kind of the point of what all of this is about. Pro-life is just that. It is pro-life. And it is not just life in the womb. It is pro-human life.
Yes.
And we wouldn't care if we did not believe that this was life and that life is worth cherishing. We would not care for the mothers if we did not think that they were made in the image of God, right? All of this is part of a piece, and that is the answer. The answer is love. It is love for life. It is love for that image of God. Um, I was just kind of thinking when you mentioned the contraception thing earlier, and you mentioned some of those statistics, and it's interesting because here we're getting into the heart of a question of a mentality of a again of an ideology of sorts. Um, that is a very common point that says, right, more contraception, less abortions.
Right.
And that has simply not been true in the United States,
Correct.
as you saw. But there are statistics that some can point to from certain European countries, which would seem to say the opposite. The distinction here is interesting, and I think it brings a kind of brings us all into focus. Is in those countries, contraception and abortion have both been legal. So as your contraception improves, becomes more successful, you see abortions begin to tick down.
You would think, right?
All right. Well, they do in some certain countries. But then here we have an example of contraception was not legal. So what's changed? Well, when contraception is legal, you're going into the procreative act with the intention of, I don't want a child to come from
So
this.
if one does result, what is your
Then we go
mindset
to
going to go?
Plan B.
Right.
Right.
And they literally have something called Plan B.
Right.
Isn't that funny?
And so, if anything, this establishes a mentality which is more likely to adopt abortion as a
Correct.
plan B than if we did not have a contraceptive mentality. Is actually goes back to contraception, right? This is really getting into the roots of this. So again, this is about a mentality. This is about a viewpoint. This is about an understanding. This is about an ideology. But that contraceptive mentality is completely opposed to reproduction happening, to life forming from this action. And so then that begins to make a lot of other things possible. It makes, let's go back to Pope Paul VI in Humanae Vitae.
Right.
He was prescient. He realized, he didn't just say, okay, the Catholic Church is opposed to contraception. He talked about what it would mean for women, how they would be mistreated. People should actually go back and read.
Oh, it's beautiful.
He gets vilified for this,
It's
right?
beautiful. I know.
You should go back and read that Humanae Vitae. It's powerful. And he was right. Why? Because the moment I have no risk of responsibility, then I am that much more likely to take advantage of you, to cheat on my spouse, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And so, sure, in the past, people would do these things and children would come from them, and no amount of responsibility will ever keep somebody from sinning. It can happen. But it certainly was a major thing to think about. Whoa, I might have a child with this person, and then I'm in a whole big mess. The moment it becomes just, it's a one-night stand, nobody's ever going to know about it, it becomes that much easier to do. And then once this mentality gets developed, you go from that to more cheating, more divorce. You go to a lot more taking advantage and objectifying of women. And then pretty soon this entire culture is changing. And so when the contraception